The European Union tonight is banning most Americans from entering.
The EU has agreed tonight on new sanctions against
The
Belarus.
EU is currently meeting to try to agree a
The
joint
EU is
strategy.
doing the best that it can, probably compared to almost any country in the
EU
world.
is really saying we've got to do something about
The EU
this.
wants a deal with the UK.
The EU is thinking about a plastics
The EU is launching
tax.
2 formal investigations.
The EU really is a paper tiger.
Okay, but who is the EU? Hi, this is Catch the Eye Politics, where we explain how European politics work in practice. I'm your host, Jimmy. In this video, we'll try to figure out who and what journalists are talking about when they conjure up the EU, and who's really in charge in Brussels. Because this is not a lecture, and I don't want to bore you, we're going to use a real-life example to do this. There's this thing called climate change. You might have heard about it. And the EU sees itself as a champion of fighting it. But recently, the EU has been fighting itself instead, over whether gas and nuclear are green, to be exact. In other words, whether they can help save the planet, or will just make things worse. This has been bubbling under the surface for a while, but it came to a boiling point when the EU published a super important, super controversial document right at New Year's, making itself very angry. So, what in the world is going on here? No matter what you personally think about nuclear and gas, isn't it weird that they would cause the EU to have such a... The reason why this story sounds so ridiculous is because it makes no sense to bunch the EU all together as if it were this singular power from Brussels, because it absolutely isn't. To understand the story, we have to understand who's doing what, because the EU is less like a person and more like a family, whose individual members have different priorities and opinions. Let's start with the important document that came out just as Australia was counting down the seconds to 2022. It was actually released by the European Commission. The European Commission is kinda like the government of the EU, but not really. Don't worry about it for now, we'll get into that in a future video. What you need to know right now is that when journalists talk about the EU doing stuff, then it's usually the European Commission. Like coming up with new laws, fining Google billions of euros, or ordering too few vaccine doses from BioNTech Pfizer and too many from AstraZeneca. You can think of the European Commission kind of like the mother of the family. She runs the daily business, takes care of the finances, and keeps everything clean. But just like in real life, Mom rarely gets the credit for everything that she does. The most important difference between the European Commission and any other government, like the one in your home country, is that the people at the very top, the commissioners, who are kind of like ministers or secretaries, care less about what will get them re-elected and more about what the people in the European Council think. What's the European Council, you ask? Well, it's the people you already know, like Emmanuel Macron, Olaf Scholz, Pedro Sanchez, Mario Draghi, or whoever is the Italian Prime Minister at the time you watch this. So the European Council is just what you call it when the 27 Prime Ministers and Presidents and Chancellors of the countries in the EU get together for fist bumps and fancy dinners every few months. But wait, if they are on the level below the EU, then why does the European Commission care so much about what they think? Well, I hate to break it to you, but they run the show. Think of the European Council kind of like the family father, who mostly stays quiet and lets Mom make most of the decisions, but when he does put his foot down, that's the end of it. Plus, he brings in most of the money. And let's get another thing out of the way. The European Council should not be confused with the Council of the European Union, which is really just an extension of the European Council for the less headline-grabbing daily business. And try not to get confused about the fact that the presidency of the Council rotates between EU countries every 6 months. That's just how it is. Oh, and then there's the Council of Europe, which is not part of the EU at all, but rather like a mini UN just for Europe. And I agree, there are too many bodies with council in the name. Can somebody please fix that? I promise that I will explain this in more detail in a future video, but I really want to get back to that New Year's Eve document before the sun sets, So, back to our story. This document, what was it about? In a nutshell, it says that the EU thinks that investments in gas and nuclear are good for the planet, in the same way that solar panels and wind farms are good for the planet. With the important difference that investments in gas will stop being good for the planet in 2035, and investments in nuclear will lose their green label in 2045. Now, the key thing is that delegated acts, like this one, are written by the Commission and, unlike other laws, are very hard for the other powers in the EU to stop or change. This means the Commission has a lot of leeway in drafting these things. But because the European Commission cares so much about what the European Council thinks, we should look at what the 27 national governments want if we want to understand why the European Commission made this interesting pitch. I'm grossly oversimplifying, but essentially there are four main groups in the EU. Those who like nuclear and gas, for example Poland, those who like nuclear but don't care about gas, like France, those who care about gas but don't really like nuclear, like Germany, and the rest. Maybe you can already see where this is going. The European Commission talked to national governments and realized that the only way to make all of these groups happy was to give everyone something they wanted, i.e., a green label for nuclear for the pro-nuclear camp, and a green label for gas for the pro-gas camp. Of course, it wouldn't be the EU if this perfect compromise didn't also make everyone a little bit unhappy. So much so that the anti-nuclear countries Austria and Luxembourg want to take the Commission to court, and a lot of people in the European Parliament have said that they will vote against the document whenever they get the chance. Now, wait a minute. There's a third group? Yep. The European Parliament, or EP, is made up of 705 members who get elected by EU citizens in an absurdly complex vote every 5 years. The European Parliament is kind of like the teenage daughter of the EU family. She has a lot of opinions and loves to voice them, but she often gets sidelined and isn't always taken seriously. Some members of the European Parliament, or MEPs for short, want to vote against the Commission's delegated act because they disagree with it. The thing is that over half of MEPs would have to do this to successfully vote down the proposal, and that's a pretty tough threshold to reach. Plus, a lot of MEPs are members of the same national parties that make up national governments across the EU. Which means, you got it, they care about what the European Council thinks too. It's not that they have to follow anyone's orders, many of them don't, but it makes the threshold even harder to reach. Let's recap. Everyone in the EU disagrees over whether nuclear and fossil gas are good for the planet or not. So the European Commission decided to solve the problem by building a delicate compromise that makes enough people just happy enough so as not to fall apart. Kind of like when everyone wants a different dish for dinner and mom decides to cook something that nobody asked for, but that everybody will eat. Now, it might sound strange to you that Austria and Luxembourg would even think about suing the Commission, but stuff like this actually happens pretty frequently in the EU. Just like in a big happy family, constant arguing is part of the fun. A good example is the Commission's infringement proceedings against EU countries. Think of it like mom's mental list of all the things that dad does wrong. It's honestly not a big deal. And that's it. Now you know why the EU will give nuclear and gas a temporary green label and
незамедлительно признать независимость и суверенитет Донецкой Народной Республики и Луганской Народной Республики.
Слава нашим захисникам, слава нашим захисницям. Слава Україні!
Okay. Obviously, the world has changed since New Year's Eve. Putin's invasion of Ukraine has made it painfully obvious that Europe is too dependent on oil, coal, and gas from Russia, and that it can't go on like this. So the European Commission has proposed to cut the import of Russian gas by 2/3 this year, and the European Council came together in Versailles to give them a green light, with some asterisks. What will ultimately come out of this is a story for another day, also because it's not fully clear yet. But what is clear is that it will be the European Council, i.e. national governments, who will lead the way for the EU. As always, really. I told you this story about nuclear and gas because it's especially controversial and full of twists and turns. But there's a bigger truth here. Even when the European Council doesn't have a formal role in the decision-making process, nothing in the EU happens without the direct or indirect approval of EU leaders. Just like a family would never go on vacation anywhere that dad doesn't want to go. And if dad can't make up his mind, the family might just stay home. Sure, it was the president of the European Commission who proposed to make Europe the first climate-neutral continent by 2050. And it was the European Parliament that voted her into office. But she was chosen by the European Council, and national governments will also be the ones to decide how and if Europe reaches its climate targets in practice. This goes far beyond climate policies though. National leaders decide if and when new countries can join the EU, how the EU should spend its money, and when it comes to Putin's war, it's the European Council that has the final call on EU sanctions against Russia. What we didn't get to talk about in this video is how this power dynamic normally plays out on the day-to-day stuff, where the European Commission is more self-confident, where the European Parliament is more influential, and where the European Council doesn't even get itself involved, but rather has the Council of the EU speak for it. What we also didn't get to talk about are all the cousins and uncles and aunts in the EU family. The Court of Justice, who is like the constitutional or supreme court of the EU. The European Central Bank, who is supposed to keep prices stable but also does some other monetary stuff. The European Court of Auditors, who checks the EU's finances. And the many other EU agencies and bodies that help oversee EU policies. But don't worry, we'll talk about all that in future videos. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this video, it's that there is no such thing as the EU. Just like there isn't the European Commission, the European Parliament, or even the French government. You could break down all of these bodies into their parts with different goals and wishes for each of them. Some of the EU's decisions and actions might look aimless at first glance, but once you look more closely, you realize that they're just the product of many different interests coming together. Now, all of this is not to say that we shouldn't use the term the EU at all. When talking about a complex machine, it helps to group different parts together, just like you might talk about the engine, the axles, or the doors of a car, even though each of these consists of smaller parts. So keep talking about the EU when it helps you keep things simple. But please don't scrap the whole car when one of its parts stops working, and don't blame the whole family if one of its members does something stupid. And next time somebody talks about the EU having done something, ask them, who do you mean? That's it for our first video. Now you know who the EU is and who's really in charge in Brussels. Please hit like if you liked it, subscribe if you want more, and leave a comment below if you've got some thoughts to share. Hey stranger, if you're still watching this, you might have liked this video. And I have some good news for you. We're recruiting. So if you would like to become part of the Catch the Eye Politics team and have some skills in video editing, researching, promotion, or anything else that might be helpful for the future of this channel, then please write me an email via the email address that you will find down below in the video description. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to your messages. It is European leaders who do things.